Good morning, everyone. It's my privilege to kick off the day by talking to you a little bit about the importance of creativity and the role that it can play in our lives, not just as leaders within our organizations, but also as individuals. We're going to go ahead and dive into the conscious, but also the unconscious side of creativity, because the unconscious can be a powerful source of creative energy. As a matter of fact, I would argue that all of us are being unconsciously creative all the time as we narratize our own lives. As we go through our days, things happen to us, we take the thousands of events and we interpret them, we emotionalize, we dramatize, and we create a single story that we all live inside. And one of the great researchers into the unconscious of the 20th century, Carl Jung, thought that was one of the most important things to understand. What myth, what is the story that we're all living inside? So it's very appropriate as we have this wonderfully elemental and alchemy-themed talk to go back to the origins of creativity and the origins of fire. And to do that, we have to dive into the realm of myth. We have to go all the way back to Prometheus. So as those of you who, like me, have a sixth grader with a Greek mythology book know, Prometheus stole fire from the gods in the original creative act and gave it to humankind. And for this, he was punished for his transgressions by being imprisoned on a rock for all of eternity, where, unfortunately, an eagle would come by each day and have lunch. So, now, in a weird way, I would actually argue that this kind of makes a little bit of intuitive sense to us. We have this cultural idea that art and suffering, creativity and suffering are somehow linked. And this makes sense because we all know there's no free lunch in nature, right? But in our culture, we sort of memorialize this to this day as the romantic archetype of the suffering artist, right? So be they starving or tortured, we have this sort of received wisdom that creativity comes at a cost for the select few. But what my experience has been is that that's actually one of the biggest myths of all. I think creativity can be a profound source of joy and that it is accessible to pretty much everyone. And the reason I think this is because I've seen it happen. It's not necessarily an inborn trait. It's more like a muscle or a practice or a perspective that you can cultivate. Before I was a strategist, I was a creative director, and I used to lead teams of people, and I had people who thought of themselves as uncreative. Learn how to cultivate that perspective, build those habits, and exercise that muscle. So this is something that's really been important to me professionally, and also a little bit personally. Bill overstates it a little bit when he says I'm an author. I've, aside from writing at work, I write for fun occasionally. I've had a couple of short stories published in a few magazines. Some of those have even made its way, I found out recently, into the Anthropic training set when there was that big publisher's lawsuit that just came out about Claude. So, when I think about the role of creativity in the age of AI, I believe that human creativity is going to become more important than ever in the age of AI. And so I offer this not as some sort of proof of expertise. This is really just context for what I'm about to share today, which is largely born out of my personal and professional experience. And that experience isn't rare. There's something like 70,000 books on creativity out there. My colleague Jen Lill is going to have a wonderful excerpt from a talk from John Cleese on creativity from 40 years ago. So I cannot promise you something wholly original. I don't have anything Promethean for you today. But as somebody who's had the privilege to make a living by playing with words and images and ideas, both individually and for fun, professionally by myself and with other people, my hope is that we can get to some ideas and some thoughts today that you can bring back to your organizations to see if you can ignite and direct and sustain your own creativity. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the link between creativity and innovation. So in the business world, we're pretty comfortable talking about innovation, right? Innovation is respectable, it's desirable. Pardon me while I open this, I'm sorry, I should have done this before. Whereas creativity has a somewhat more checkered reputation. It's a little bit messier, it's unstructured, it's unpredictable, and unpredictability means risk. Now, I hope that you come away with this thinking that some of those risks really have some asymmetric upsides for your business and for your culture. And yet, despite seeming to be opposites in some ways, what I found is that the two are really intrinsically linked. Creativity, which comes from the unconscious, as I mentioned, generates this novelty. And then if you can teach yourself certain habits of mind, you can use innovation to structure that novelty and to make it useful. So creativity and innovation tend to feed each other in a virtuous loop. Or to put it another way, innovation is creativity's finishing school. Or to reframe that, creativity is innovation's unconscious. It's that Jungian shadow. And so if we think about these things as two sides of the same coin, what I would invite you to do is remember this idea of the reframe. I'm going to share some examples later on about how you can find relationships between two loosely related or even seemingly unrelated things, and show how we have applied that thinking, not just to our work at One North, but how we can also apply it to professional development. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why I think creativity matters more than ever in the age of AI. Well, there are some things that AI is really great at, things like efficiency and scale and pattern recognition. But for the most part, people really remain crucial for imaginative work, generating insights, constructing resonant meaning. And so what is this thing that we call creativity? How would we define this? One definition that I've always liked is it's useful novelty. And so if we think about creating something new, we have to think about what's possible. There's a great systems thinker named Stuart Kaufman who has this idea of the adjacent possible. And what it basically means is, in any given set of circumstances, what's sort of the next step that you can take? And what sort of decision tree does that create for you? What other kinds of possibilities are adjacent to that one? And the thought experiment that he uses when he talks about this is what are all the possible uses you can think of for a screwdriver? And in the book, in the thought experiment, he collects some of the things that his students have said over the years. You can use it to screw in screws, but you can also use it as a hammer to hammer in nails. You can go ahead and use it as a paperweight. You can scrape some putty off of a window. You can use it to wedge open a door. You can tie it to a bamboo pole and go spearfishing. You can loan the spearfishing pole to your friend and collect 5% of the gross. His point was there's not an infinite number of things that you can do, but the number of things that you could do is indefinite. So what that means is that you can't order it numerically. You can only order it on a nominal scale. Well, why is this important for creativity in AI? Well, it's because that algorithms work on numerical scales, but human beings aren't limited by that, right? We don't have to just make calculations. We can make extrapolations. We don't just have to make absolute judgments. We can make relative ones. So this has important implications for the nature of creativity, which maybe we can go ahead and sharpen our definition and say that it is non-algorithmic, useful novelty. Stunning display of creativity there. So if we get pedantic with our definition for today, this is what I would invite us to go ahead and consider it as. All right, so let's get into it. The art and the science of starting a fire. So again, if creativity is a muscle, if it's a practice, if it's a perspective that you can cultivate, what is that perspective? Well, for us at One North, it's kind of what you could say is a campfire perspective. We want to invite people to collaborate from all different kinds of disciplines and create a culture of openness and exchange. And part of how you do that is by cultivating an ethos that privileges certain things above others, which we memorialized in these kind of questions here, or excuse me, these perspectives. Privileging curiosity over certainty, being a little bit vulnerable, especially as leaders. Privileging questions over answers. And this one is actually, paradoxically, probably really important, even when you're under time pressure. And that is the importance of relaxing into a problem, rather than just trying to go ahead and grind through it. Because it turns out that creative work, it really can't happen when you're under those kinds of high pressures. So one of the things that my team and I do every year is we have an annual planning exercise where we choose a theme. And the theme a couple years ago was really meant to highlight this last value. And that was to relax into the problem. And so another stunning display of creativity. The silliness here is actually kind of part of the point, though. It is to demonstrate openness and to kind of get people a little bit loosened up. What I would invite you to consider is sort of the agenda that we have, which is something you can feel free to borrow, steal, adapt for yourself, We always go ahead and mark out professional goals that we want to achieve, but we will also put down personal goals. And there's a really important exercise we go through called ask and offer. The idea is that if you have something that is a personal goal that you think requires collaboration to achieve, you can go ahead and make an explicit ask of somebody, or you can just signal on the Miro board that we use your openness to somebody else offering to help with it. And then, of course, when we do the offer, the idea is that you can go around and look at everyone's goals, and you can go ahead and make a bid to collaborate. And the really important thing for this is that leaders do it too. We all go around, we make the ask, and we make the offer. And that's to create an atmosphere of psychological safety. And that's really important because psychological safety is oxygen for your creative fire. So these are some ways just to get some sparks going, but once we have those sparks, how do we go ahead and fan the flames? How do we go ahead and get people around that campfire? Well, I mentioned the importance of privileging questions over answers and certainty, right? So when we're clearing the campsite and we're gathering some kindling, we're asking ourselves these kinds of questions. These are the ones that tend to come up again and again. What if we deviated from the brand guidelines for just one round of creative ideation, right? How might we push this idea that we have to the sharpest and most emotional expression of itself? What would it take to really over-deliver on this particular project? These are the sort of habits of mind that we try to build and we try to ask as we go ahead and generate as many ideas as we can that answer these questions during one of the phases of our project. This is the divergent thinking phase where we really want to just encourage people to throw out ideas. And this is sort of the cliche of like, there's no bad idea in a brainstorm, but it turns out that the cliches are true. No is a fire extinguisher for creative fire. And part of the reason for this is sometimes an idea that's not working leads you to an idea that is. Sometimes an idea that seems bad is actually a bridge to a great idea. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to just go ahead and shut that down. You want to go ahead and let as many ideas flourish and build in the time that you have. One of the ways that we do that is we explicitly invite people out to play. This is just an excerpt from a Miro board when we're teaching clients or new colleagues how to onboard with us and use some of our tools. It's just simple gamification, but it's an easy handle on what can be an intimidating onboarding process. We just want to go ahead and show people, here's how we work, and get that conversation started that leads to that openness and exchange. Another exercise we love to do is to ask, what do we like, and why do we like it? And this is especially helpful during really subjective creative exercises like naming, which was here. And the idea here is not just to go ahead and create a positive mood. It's to help us establish a common vocabulary and a common frame of reference so that we can actually tune into each other's creative frequencies. And this is really important because you want to be able to go ahead and speak the same language as people, and you want to be able to go ahead and yes and their idea and not shut it down. So during this phase, we're also just trying to go for volume. You know, quantity has a quality all its own. So this is just an excerpt of some of our team's work. You know, this was after 2 days. I think after a week, we got into to 15 ideas with 3 people. And the idea here is that, you know, we're building these out as stories. We're building these out with mood boards for inspiration. Right now, though, we're not making any strong judgments. We're really just trying to put as many ideas on the field of play as possible. Because once you've got that fire going, then it's time to go ahead and pour in the gas. Thanks to Kelsey for improving my terrible animation here. This one's much better. So this is the other half of that double diamond. This is where we want to go ahead and we want to start being intentional about how we channel the fire. And to do that, we have to kind of switch into a convergent thinking way of being. So some of those accelerant techniques are, again, questions. This one is really, really good for burning away analysis paralysis. What would need to be true for this to work? There's a great book by a Harvard-trained strategist named Richard Rummelt. But earlier in his career, he worked as a jet propulsion engineer for NASA. He never says he was a rocket scientist, which is such an awesome humble brag, but he was. And he worked on Surveyor, which was one of the early moon probes before we ever went there. His job was to design the lander. And here's the thing, we did not know what the surface of the moon actually was. It might be 5 miles of dust, and it might go ahead and sink forever. It might be made of razor blades, and it might shred the tires. And so finally, after the team was paralyzed by months of this, his boss basically said, look, we've seen a couple of telescope photos. It looks like the southwestern US desert. Just decide, the moon looks like the southwestern US desert. And the team was kind of floored. They're like, well, that seems so irresponsible. How can you do that? But the idea here is when you don't know what the next thing to do is, you look at the adjacent possible. You go ahead and you choose that proximate objective, and you just decide. In our team, we're paralyzed. We memorialize this as the moon is made of cheese. When people are really stuck on something and we need to go ahead and end the discussion, we make a decision and we just go for it. So the next one is to ask ourselves, what if the opposite were true? And this is really how we prioritize that ethos of holding uncertainty and not being too sure of ourselves. This one is really good for taking your creative ideas and trying to push them to the edge to find the truest and best expression of itself. A couple years ago, we had a hospitality client who was appealing to meeting planners. And one of the things that they gave us in the brief, which was excellent, was just the amount of anxiety that kind of goes into planning a celebration. And there's kind of a interesting emotional tension there, right, between that anxiety and that celebration. So the original creative idea was, well, what if we sort of underplay it? What if we say hey, it's not rocket science, right? Hey, again, here's that jet propulsion engineer stuff again. But when we looked at this, we thought, well, what if that actually isn't enough? What if we asked ourselves if the opposite was true? What if it wasn't, don't worry, planning isn't rocket science. It's way harder. Does a rocket science have to figure out how my 3 cousins who can't be in the same room can go ahead and share a table? No, of course not. So the idea here was to go ahead and honor that anxiety by validating it and then moving past it to go ahead and get to a truer and better expression that actually wrapped up the value proposition from the client. So these are some of the techniques that we do to take those dozens of ideas and really winnow them down to a few. And we still want to hold these loosely. We never come up with the one true idea because we like to have multiple ways to be right. So when we're looking at some of these accelerant techniques, the last one is, what relationship exists between these ideas? And this one is really good to go ahead and generate insights, some of which can be game-changing. And at One North, we think of an insight as not just an interesting fact, but an interesting relationship between facts. If you juxtapose 2 facts or 2 ideas, are they in tension? Are they in conversation with each other? What are sort of the implications of one on the other? And everything that I've told you so far today, this next case study is kind of a freight train engine that pulls all these slides into one example that we had a couple years ago when the country of Singapore was issuing a charter for a new digital bank. One North got tapped to help do some creative work for the recruitment strategy. But because of the structure of the engagement, it was really, really fast. We had to come up with these ideas, and they had to be done in a couple days. All right, no problem. There's always a brief from the client. And so the good news is, we always find out who's the client so we can do some background research. We go ahead and take a look at their segmentation, targeting, and positioning. We want to go ahead and make sure that we've understood their value properly and what their brand story is, who their competitors are, go through all the 4 C's. And of course, find out what those business goals are, and what are the KPIs. The challenge was that because of the structure of this engagement, we weren't permitted to know any of these things. To protect the integrity of the process, we didn't know the client's name. To this day, I still don't know the client's name. All right, so what do you do in this situation? You look around for a screwdriver. This was the brief we had, just tell the story. And we thought, okay, let's tell the story. What's the adjacent possible? What do we have? And what the team had were our email addresses, which we traded to a bunch of consultancies to download white papers on the Singaporean banking industry over one weekend so that we could show up on Monday with some ideas. Here's what we found. We found out that our target market were entrepreneurs. They were folks who really wanted stability and autonomy. And yet, the findings also had another interesting fact that seemed to be in tension with this. And that was that they were changing jobs at a rate that far exceeded the industry average, as well as other industries' average. And these 2 facts seemed to be in conversation or in tension with each other. And the insight here was, maybe people are torn between the desire to stay and the desire to look for the next big thing. And so we dug more into the research. And that's how we came up with some of those other things here. And we thought maybe the strategy is this new company is going to have to give loyalty to get loyalty. And so this became the basis for our get who to buy strategy. How do we go ahead and get Singaporean financial talent who are searching for the next great thing to go ahead and stop job switching and invest in Newco's story by showing that Newco's invested in them? And of course, because we were told in the brief was just tell the story, we went ahead and did that. And because we want more than one way to be right, we had a second backup just in case. So I've mentioned today that I still don't know who the client was. That's because we didn't win this work. This wasn't an opportunity that worked out. But one of the stakeholders who saw this moved to another client and brought that client to One North, and they've been our client now for 4 years. So sometimes an idea that isn't working leads you to the idea that does. So this balance between the unconscious and the conscious, between playful creativity and like purposeful rigor is really tough to get right. The person that I think really exemplifies this ethos best is the author of Madame Bovary, Gustave Flaubert, who talks about the importance of being neat and orderly in your life so that you can be super original in your work. So let's talk about creativity in our own lives. How do we go ahead and tend this fire daily? Well, again, if creativity is a muscle, a practice, a perspective you can cultivate, let's talk about some of the things that we've learned. We've talked a little bit about the importance of inviting the unconscious out to play. We've talked about the importance of relaxing into the problem. We want to go ahead and stay curious so that we can go ahead and engage in continuous learning. And we want to go ahead and create and sharpen meaning, especially when it comes to the myth that we all live inside. And that applies even to our old friend Prometheus. So in some versions of the myth, Prometheus winds up there for eternity, but in some, he's actually freed. And I love how this complicates the myth, how it offers additional interpretations. And the reason that I think that this is really applicable to our own lives is, as leaders within an organization, we're often tasked with professional development, and we have to evaluate our own strengths and weaknesses, as well as the folks who report to us. And what I've often found is that strengths and weaknesses, both in myself and the people with whom I work, are often two sides of the same coin. Somebody who's really great at zooming in on the details can sometimes get lost in them. Sometimes who's excellent at big picture thinking sometimes has a challenging time seeing the details. And so if you can go ahead and understand these two things as two sides of the same coin, you can actually create development plans that teach people how to modulate. You can actually reframe somebody's weakness into a strength and caution them when a strength has gone too far and is at risk of tipping over into a weakness. And really what this does is this gives us optionality. It lets us go ahead and rewrite the myth that we're living in and lead to a better understanding of ourselves and each other. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Any initial questions from the audience? All right, sweet. I get to pick on people right away. All right, Ken from BRG. You're my first person I'm going to pick on. Oh, look at that. So, question, how do you create space for creativity?
Create space for creativity. It's challenging since we're always so fast-paced and what is next. With my team, I try to give them the space. So taking some things off their plates to give them the opportunity to have a little bit more time, a little bit more thinking, dive a little bit deeper when possible.
Okay. Where's Ava? Ava, you were on my mind too for this topic. How do you make space for creativity for yourself and for your team?
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. The brainstorming reference that Kevin, you had put in kind of building some structure around it to allow opportunity for people to bring their ideas without feeling, threatened in some way, I think is a really big component of how I like to lead those. And I think out of those, I agree. I think it gives people the opportunity to kind of come and bring their own ideas and then work through it together so that by the time that you end up with whatever like the final idea is, everyone feels like they're fully bought into it. And then my expectation going forward is that everyone is like 100% in and kind of pushing that idea forward. But I do like in the beginning to at least give people the opportunity to kind of bring all of that thinking so that they feel like they have some piece of like ownership and accountability on kind of wherever it is that we net out.
I think that's, and something I think we're going to talk about in one of our talks later, the idea of psychological safety, right? We've heard that talk, like that term for years. That's an important piece to do to be able to promote the openness and creativity that happens. Because the point about shutting things down right away, you stamp out the fire and then you don't get anything out of that.
That's right. Damp logs.
I was going to say, so Kevin, one of the other questions I had, the enemies of creativity. What do you think those are that we need to watch out for?
That's great. I think being overly rigid. at One North, we like to have a methodology, but not be like methodologically bound by it. I think there's a lot of danger in deciding that you found the one true way to do something. That's the biggest enemy.
Okay. And that's, I think, very true. Like Ryan talked about last night, processes, discovery, define, design, develop, deploy, such. It's easy to feel like we have to fit everything within a singular process if
No.
we don't make space for it.
Yeah, sometimes the opposite of a great idea, as Roy Sutherland likes to say, is another great idea.
Anyone questions? Oh, all right. Addie, what have you got?
I just have a question around, like, if you have any tips or perspective around balancing speed with creativity. Like, how do you make sure you kind of don't run over those important sort of spaces to let people have that time to kind of play and throw ideas out there?
Sure. A little bit each day is better than like an hour once a week. It just gets you unstuck. It's fluency. It's a daily habit. It's going ahead and exercising that muscle and just being consistent with it. Consistency actually leads to speed, I found.
Way in the back.
Yeah, I'm curious how you follow up and measure success. Being kind of outside of a company, do you come back over time and see how what you've done performs? Kind of, do you set that measurement of success up before you even get started?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the project. Like if we're doing like a brand campaign or like a brand identity project, sometimes we're doing like an annual brand perception survey to find out how that stuff performed year over year. If it's like a shorter term performance marketing campaign, there might be like return on ad spend or ROI measures. It kind of depends on what the project is. But yeah, I mean, we're typically coming back to go ahead and make sure that we have some sort of measurable results. Find me later. There is a guy who sort of keeps a leaderboard of factors that influence ROI and creativity. I'll dig out his name. I just can't remember it right now.
Anyone else? Ryan Scholes. This is going to be a loaded question for sure.
I've had the pleasure of pitching with Kevin over the years. We had an instance last week where we had two great parts of a creative presentation and one part that fell flat. You talked about failure on the Singapore Bank initiative. Talk about how you get your team over failure, because it's inevitably part of the process, and I think it's an important part for this room because most of the folks in this room aren't in inherently creative practices.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that.
I think it's really important to take the work seriously and take yourself seriously not at all. I mean, I think that the work is important, and the best way to get over a failure like that is to tackle the next problem. Even that, though, it's sort of like you don't know what the failure is going to lead to. You don't really know if it is a failure. I think it's, if there's one consistent theme that sort of recurs throughout this, it's like, don't be so quick to judge. Be quick to generate an idea, but don't be so quick to judge it. Just see how it lands and see how it plays. And if you don't take yourself super seriously, but you take the work really seriously, it becomes a lot easier to generate and then let go of ideas. The challenge comes when somebody has an idea, and that's their only idea, and they build a temple around it. And the thing is, the idea is just like, it's just the starting point, it's just the ingredient. Hand it off to somebody else. Let them blow it up, let them reassemble it, see what they can do. A thing I'll always say to my team is throw rocks. I'll show people an idea, I'll be like, throw rocks, knock down the stuff that's weak, help me stand up to that something stronger. So I would encourage everyone to, for the failure, throw rocks at the idea, see what falls down, stand up something stronger. And then just go to your next idea. It's okay.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.